Hi, it's Jen from Shabby Fabrics back with Love Notes Mystery Quilt. We're in our final week together. We are having so much fun unwrapping the mystery, and it's just amazing how the blocks are just clicking together as we go along. Now let's jump right into section 5. I've got some things on the table with me. We had some leftover parts that I was like, did I miss something? And sure enough, they've caught up to us with that extra piece of fabric called Twitter padded. So we've got that out, and we have our beautiful teal leather. We've got 2 little pieces of fusible applique. It's another envelope for our cute little bird who's coming in with another envelope, ironing that together. Just a reminder with leather to be sure to use your pressing cloth, and you'll be using the heat and bond on the back of that. So I've traced that out. Be sure to use a micron pen. Don't use a disappearing pen because it will truly disappear. And you'll just iron that to the back side. We can quickly do that. We have a lot to cover. So you've seen me do this step before, ironing that down and going ahead and cutting on directly on the line. We get our background fabric and our layout diagram basically here. We're going to use that pressing cloth and iron that down to the background. So we're going to quickly move on. I want to show you what that block looks like. There's again so much to cover because it is really our assembly. So once we have that all stitched down, absolutely adorable, we stitched around our leather with, of course, our teal thread. And with the envelope, you have that choice again. If you want to be able to do the satin stitch, you would trace that, or if you want to be able to use the glitter, go ahead and cut a piece of glitter there instead. Iron that down, of course, with your pressing cloth and then stitch around. We've got some satin stitch on the tail feathers of the bird. Just like before, you'll use your light box and your disappearing pen, trace that and use your satin stitch in your hot pink. Square that block up to 4.5 and you're ready to literally jump into putting everything together. Now I brought this out because I wanted to mention something to you that I discovered as I was preparing for this video, and I realized there was an extra little something in my embellishing kit and I did not know what that was for. And as I was progressing through section 5, I thought maybe this is when I'll discover when this piece of, it's kind of like a vinyl will be used. So it's called the white vinyl embroidery topping, and I actually called Kimberbell about that. This is only for machine embroidery. So if you've been wondering, as I have, when are we going to use that? Since we'll be doing the sewing version, this is something you will not be doing. Go ahead and put that in your sewing or craft room because there may be a project down the road, or maybe someday you will get that embroidery machine and you'll be looking for that very product. So go ahead and put that aside. We won't be using that together for this particular project since we are doing the sewing version. So we have progressed all through our blocks. This one's ready to go. We're going to sew the quilt together. And boy, for me, preparing for this video was challenging because I didn't know how much to do ahead of time. You certainly don't want to watch me sew this together block by block, but there's pointers that I want to share with you that I discovered as I was sewing some of the sections together. Now, of course, you're seeing that this is not sewn together, so we might just jump ahead real quick to row 4, and I'll grab out those elements and we can sew those together, and I can just show you some of the things that I think about when I'm sewing rows together. The pressing is really your discretion, and that's some of the main things that I want to talk about. Now first, one thing I already loved as I was sewing some of the rows together is I love that I got to cut things out with the pop ruler. It made these blocks going together so fantastic and so easy to be accurate because they've been perfectly cut with the pop rulers. So I'm completely sold on these. I now know that when I get ready to do another applique block for any project, Kimberbell or otherwise, I'm going to definitely oversize my background and then cut it down because I realized how wonderful it was to sew the pieces together knowing they were perfectly cut. So the first thing we'll do with row 4, again, we're jumping ahead, is we're just going to sew the top to the bottom, and I definitely recommend pinning. You don't want anything to shift here. So we'll be using a standard 1/4" seam allowance, and you know, you can just be using a white or a gray, a light gray thread throughout all of your piecing. You're really done at this point with your colored thread. You can just add that to your sewing collection of thread. And let's go sew with our 1/4" seam allowance. We'll go ahead and get that iron. I see that's heating up to a full hot setting. And for me, that's a linen setting. And be sure you're sewing with a very accurate 1/4" seam allowance. Now, one thing that is you get to choose is which direction to press. Now, as we look forward into the pattern, this is kind of like going to the end of the book and reading the ending, but right now I'm going to do that with you. Why? Because sometimes knowing what's going to be sewn to what matters in how you may choose to press. We're going to jump forward. It's your pattern, you're allowed to do that, to the very back and see the adorable quilt here. And as I look at this block in the bottom row here, whether I press the seam up or down, there is nothing adjacent to it that I'm trying to nest. If there was, it would be part of my consideration. In this case, that is not the situation, and so you have the choice of pressing up or down as you prefer. So I have a piece of, in this instance, we put a piece of that interfacing on the back, and so look at how my seam naturally actually wants to go up. So if you have that situation where the seam is telling you where it wants to go with it. If I hadn't had that interfacing on the back, and this was a darker fabric, I would press to the darker. That happened, and I'll show you when we get into that top row actually. This block here with the camera, and then we just click. When I sewed that together, and that was one of the blocks we didn't have any interfacing on, I went ahead and actually pressed to the dark. Why? Because just in case some of that teal comes down in the seam allowance and you see it, you're much more likely to see a darker color coming through the light. So by default, if you don't have a preference, press to the dark. All right, we've done that. And now we just look at how everything just fits. It just fits perfectly. You can see how everything going together perfectly depends on that 1/4" seam allowance being right on the money. So when I'm pinning something like this, we know that this needs to hit and this needs to hit. Don't just start pinning and let this just drift off. I want you to pin your sections together where that you know it must begin here, and we know that it must end down there. So we're going to always pin the beginning and the end. And then if you feel inclined to put in some extra pins, go ahead and then fill them in the middle. There was a time in my early quilting days where I just kind of pinned left to right, and where it ended, and I trimmed it off. We don't do it like that anymore because this is far more precise. So let's sew that together again. Again, very important 1/4" seam allowance. Okay, now I think you already know where I'm going to go with this next. If I just open the seam, what can you see, right? I've got this stiffer piece of fabric back here. I've got a seam right here. You can already see that this wants to press in that direction. So when your quilt is telling you where it wants to press, go ahead and go with that unless there's a compelling reason to not do that. Now I know that there's a piece of leather here. If you're concerned about that, go ahead and use the pressing cloth. I think because I'm on the back side of that, I feel comfortable pressing without the pressing cloth. Now if I'm going to repress from the front side, just because, go ahead and grab that pressing cloth out. It's going to be a very easy thing to forget to do that because we're not used to sewing with glitter and we're not used to sewing with leather and all these other very unique kind of substrates, vinyl. Never sewn with that before. All right, so that's this section of our quilt. Now I went ahead and sewed the mailboxes together. Let me grab that out. I have my mailboxes over here. Again, it was kind of tricky trying to decide what do I do ahead of time. This was pretty straightforward. Knowing that what was going to be above that, knowing that I had a unit that had 2.5-inch squares and applique blocks that were cut to 2.5, I went ahead and sewed those together and pressed all of my seams open because you can see that it evenly distributes the bulk, which is this is what drove my decision to press those seams open. If you're going to press these seams open, press these seams open. If you decide to press all of your seams this direction, then press all of these seams that direction. It's your decision, but just keep in mind that what happens here influences what's going to happen here. So that's why I just said, you know what? I think to distribute the bulk evenly, let's press that seam open. And as a result, so that this would piece together properly, I also pinned those. Now looking at this here, the first thing you want to evaluate is, do these all match up? Is this row going to fit that row? You and I know that we cut those to 2.5 inches and they should finish at 2. So you can always go check. The best way to know if you've got accurate 1/4-inch seam allowances is to just measure. So let's go ahead and we can just take our ruler and say, is that 2 inches? Is that 2 inches? Is that 2? It's the fastest way to know if you have a chunky seam or too light of a seam and you maybe need to seam rip and adjust. So as I check all of those, they appear to be on. Now on the ends, because we only have one seam here, that should measure 2 1/4. So let's check that. And let's check the other one real quick. And of course, we know from our patterns, if you're ever not sure what those block sizes should be, our pattern told us what size to cut those to, right? So if that pattern told us to cut those to 6.5 inches wide, when this is sewn together, this should measure 6 and these should measure 6 1/4. I believe that's what we should be measuring. Yes. Okay. So I feel like this should go together very nicely, and you can imagine we want these seams to come together. With that in mind, making sure everything's oriented properly, we're just going to flip this down. We're going to pin here. We're going to pin here, and we're going to pin at those very important intersections because those aren't negotiable. That's something that we know needs to happen, and things in between can stretch just a touch if need be. So I'm going to pin here and here. It's got to work like that. Now if you find that your row, let's say your top row is too long, that means one of your seam allowances was too narrow. Figure out which one it is by measuring and simply seam rip and re-sew that section. Now, normally mine is, this would be too short. That's my miss. My miss is sewing more than 1/4 inch. Figure out which one it is, go ahead and seam rip that and re-sew that with the proper 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fix this. Don't trim your block later. Fix the row and then sew the blocks together. So I really want to encourage you to take the time to figure out where things might have went a little askew and give yourself a little grace, knowing that, hey, none of us are perfect at this, and this is still a hobby. Have fun. You know, don't stress out. Maybe take a little break, come back, do a quick little seam ripping, and then re-sew that. You'll be so much happier with the results. I've looked at quilts that I've done early on, and I was like, oh, that's good enough. You know what? I regret not taking that extra 30 minutes or 20 minutes and just fixing it when I could have. So we'll pin those important points. And I'm going to pin here as well. Plenty of pinning. You cannot overpin this. Now I'm pinning, some of you learned pinning from this side, right, like this. The reason and me included by the way, the reason I don't do this anymore is as I approach the pin, I take it out. I don't like sewing over pins. I know there's people that do. I've had a bad experience with that where I broke my needle. My needle went inside my machine. I had to have it serviced, and I've just had a bad experience with that. So now I pin on this side, down the seam, with my head of my pin outside the track of my 1/4" seam allowance. It allows the pin to stay engaged in the project, and I'm not unseating anything while I'm sewing the 1/4" seam. So notice every single one of my seams has a pin in it, and that is what I would do at home too. This is not just on camera for your benefit. This is truly how to get the most accurate piecing. Now we will go ahead and sew again a very nice accurate 1/4" seam allowance all along here. So let's see how we did. What I'm looking for here is to see if I actually hit those points right here, because I really want those to line up nicely. Let's look. I'm very happy with where those hit, but you know, that's just pinning. It's good pinning, it's good measuring, and of course those amazing pop rulers that help these blocks just be so perfect was wonderful. Now let's look at that. There's a lot of bulk going on here. Naturally, our seam wants to press that way. We're not going to resist that. So let's go ahead and heat that seam up first. Anytime you preheat a seam, it just seems like it gives just a little bit more pliability, a more willingness to move in the direction that you prefer. Let me just go like that. Now, if you give your fabric just a gentle pull, you're going to hopefully avoid what I call a tuck, which can happen when the fabric, let me show you what I'm talking about. Right here, you can see as I pull this, I'm going to kind of exaggerate that. You can start to see the threads there. I'm not suggesting you have that kind of pull because you could distort your block, but you also want to have at least something. Otherwise, as you press that, do you see how you can actually take a tuck and the fabric gets stuck up in there? So there's a certain amount of, you can feel me do that. Now I just noticed something that I just did, and I want to show this to you, and I'm going to fix it. Remember how I sewed this like this? This was on the top. What was I not able to see? The seam's on the bottom, and look what I have. This is called a rolled seam. Now in the old days, I would have just lived with that. But I know ultimately that my block won't press out quite as flat as I would like, and I'm going to fix that. And the easiest way to fix that is I'm just going to take out That's all I have to do. And I'm going to go back to my machine. Now on this side, I'm going to start here, back stitch once, go across that, past that by about 1/4 of an inch, back stitch and stop. Just fix these things along the way versus just accepting these slight little errors that happen. They just happen, right? You couldn't see it. I couldn't see it. So let's fix that. I'll take just a little stitch back. You know, those little corrections, that probably took me about a minute, and it's worth it. All of these things, especially after this journey that we've been on together, this is not the time in the very end to cut the corners because you're like, I just want this project done. You know what? Take that time to just polish it and make sure everything is exactly where as it should be. So again, I'll just continue to press, just gently pulling and trying to be as even as I can, not to distort anything, and then we'll come back and examine that from the front side. And some people like to press actually from both sides, both the back side first and then the front. If that's you, just remember you've got some leather on the front side and you're going to want to be using your pressing cloth so that you don't inadvertently scorch that, because your iron now is on a full linen setting. If there was ever a time that you could potentially do some damage, it would be now with it on its hottest setting. So let's look and see how we did. I think I will press from the front again, or go ahead and press from the front, just because, see, it's not as laying as flat as I would like. And again, I will just pull down. You know, pressing is just as important. It's one of those integral steps. Quilting really starts with a high quality fabric. Absolutely. I learned my lesson a long time ago. I bought some inexpensive fabric because that's what my budget was. And I also had someone who was an avid quilter give me some quilt shop quality fabric, and I mixed those fabrics, not knowing the difference. And I made an Americana quilt. And as time passed, the really cheap fabric faded. And then the really beautiful fabric I had held its color for on. And I basically, it became very visually clear to me that there's a difference in fabric. So A, choosing good quality fabric, good thread, 1/4 inch seam allowance, pressing matters. Pressing matters. So we never want to underestimate the importance of that step as well. It's easily forgotten, and of course accurate cutting is critical as well. All right, that's that portion, and now we have this portion, and we're going to sew those together to complete that row. So let's see how our piecing is doing. If we're all the same size still, which we should be, beautifully. All right, now I'm going to go ahead, right sides together. I'm just going to flip this around. I like having the smaller piece on top when it makes sense to do so. We'll pin very accurately. Now it's very easy to just be focusing on this. Stack this piece, this whole unit on top of the other one. Of course you're lining up those corners, but it's very easy to do this. You see how this is off here? And while it looks like these are lined up, and they are, look at this. That can lead to errors that you can't actually detect until a little bit later. There's a little bit of a twist. So go ahead and line this up physically on stacking on top of it. Then I kind of just scoot that up there, and then let's pin that. Remember, beginning and end of that row, and then we can pin in between if we want to. And I do recommend that. We'll sew another 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now this is a little bit bulky because it's got that interfacing on it. So this may look like the edge of my fabric. It's actually not. That's the edge of my fabric. This is just interfacing. So that fabric is stacked right on top of that. Let's go sew that 1/4 inch seam allowance and we'll finish that row. Okay, so we have a row together now. This goes together actually very quickly, but we don't want to rush those important steps, and we've been taking our time where we need to be taking that time. So let's iron that. And I can see that my seam definitely wants to go in that direction. So I'm going to say, yes, let's do that. I think that's a good idea too. So as you know, there's 4 sections, basically 4 rows of our quilts, and you'll be following those same steps. I wanted to show you, I'm a little out of sequence. We did our last row because that was the Twitter padded block was in that final row. But I went ahead and sewed those other rows together following the same exact process. So I can grab those out and we can kind of turn through our pattern and see what's next. I'm just going to move some things out of the way for the moment. So we did our row 4. Let's just look at that. I want to show you how we press things. So with we just click this one here. When I sewed those together, remember I did not have the interfacing on the back of this one, and therefore, you know, there wasn't a bulk there. So I said, let's press toward the teal. Then we sewed the cameras together, sewing this on the top. And in that case, looks like I went up on that one. Sounds good to me. And you know why I did that? Because of this intersection here. You can see if I would have pressed this down, that just doesn't want to go there. And that's because of this seam. You know, things press, people move away from pressure. So does fabric. So just keep in mind that whenever you have a seam, you're likely to push away to the block that doesn't have any seams. So that's what made sense here. And in this regard, because there was a seam, I pressed to this block. And it looks like here you'll be able to put your own selfies in there, and there's a felt cut heart in there, which is really fun. So that strip is done. Then we went on to this one. I just wanted to show you again what I did here. Knowing that that pieced unit, remember it's just like the other one where I made the decision to go ahead and press those open. Similarly, I wanted to evenly distribute the bulk. Those are all pressed open. But as we got here with all of those seams, I'm definitely going to press toward the jar. Here I press toward the jar again. So this row is done as well. So cute. And then with this row here, and that was of course just sewing everything together. So what's next in this pattern? We have a row sewn together. Now what are we going to do? Let's look here. Sashing, borders, and binding. We've got our rows, so now we need to basically attach everything together with our sashing / inside borders. Let me grab those out for you. I definitely want to talk to you a little bit about your borders. Grab that. Well, I have pre-cut it. I want to give you some pointers, something that I historically do when I'm sewing, and it's just a suggestion. Do with it what you will, use it or not, but I always like to share. People ask me questions, I love to share. So I've cut my 7 1.5 inch by width of fabric strips, nothing out of the ordinary there, just careful cutting of course. And then the outer border, we're cutting 4 1.5 by width of fabric strips. And as you can see, it's a pretty prominent part of this quilt. So if you grab your piece of fabric, and I'll grab myself a bigger ruler here. Of course, you want to be using your ruler, biggest ruler that you have. So the first thing I always like to do whenever I am cutting a border is go ahead and bring my selvages, just kind of let the fabric hang. Of course, I would have pressed that out. I guess I do need this back out, don't I? Just to go ahead and give that a good press. make that all nice and smooth. And then I examine my fabric. There's some fabric that has a pattern to it, and I want to see, do I need to fussy cut that? What is fussy cutting? Fussy cutting is, unlike here where I just lined the fabric up, made sure I was straight to my table, my selvages matched, and I cleaned off my edge and I just cut 1.5 inch strips. There's really nothing to consider except accurate cutting. Here I'm like, is there a pattern that I need to be kind of aware of? Is there something that I might want to be conscious of? And it's a little bit like cutting a plaid or a gingham. Some people don't care. They go ahead and just cut it, and whatever it is, it is. Other people want to have that plaid kind of square. And if that's you, if you have that consideration, this might be something that you similarly find significant. Now that our selvages are brought up together, we have our fabric pressed, we could absolutely bring this to the table, clean off the edge, and just start cutting our 4.5 inch strips. If you're like, well, I really like polka dots to be straight, or I like my plaid to be straight, or whatever that is that you're doing, then one thing that you might consider is not cutting the fabric double, it's called doubled and fold, but you go ahead and open it up instead. And if that's you, then the first thing that I look at is I'm like, okay, are my polka dots, is this a predictable pattern? And it absolutely is. You can see that it's a kind of a grid of 4. So as I see my first full polka dot here, I can see it kind of drifting off the table. Well, it kind of comes here and then it comes there. I really like to have my fabric where my polka dots are going to be tracking along my border. What does that mean? First off, we know that for 4.5 inch borders, that's 18 inches. And we have, I believe in your kit, you have 5/8 of a yard, I believe. So you have a little bit of room to play with. You don't have forever to be able to play with the fabric, but you do have some space. So let's say that I want to establish this polka dot, and maybe to the left of that polka dot. Maybe that's my best starting point. Then what I do is I lay my ruler, I try to get my fabric as straight as possible. And now I'm shooting my eyes down this lane, and I want to establish a line. And as I draw the fabric toward me, I keep looking. I'm just establishing that line right now, and I'm going to keep going to the very left of that. Now I bring my ruler back because you don't want to twist in these borders. You don't want that. Not every fabric is able to be fussy cut, by the way. Not all can be. And just the way it's out on the table, there's a lot going on. So it takes time, and that's why they call it fussy cutting, right? It's more fussy to do this. But if I lay my ruler back so that I'm along where I was, it helps me to, you don't want to just put your ruler here and keep going, because you could easily do this along that. You don't want that. You want to come back into where you just were and kind of feather this. I want to bring that over just a touch because I don't want to have a curvy border. There we go. Here we are. Let's keep, yep, I'm just to the left of that. Now I've established, I'm going to turn that around. This is now my guide. This is my guide. Now I can lay my ruler at 4.5. Once you establish it, now you go. Four and a half. I think I distorted that just a touch. Now I'm not lining up on my table anymore. Everything is based on my ruler. So you see how my polka dots now, I'm kind of hitting the right side of that polka dot because I hit that repeat. I found that spot. Now, for some people, like, that's just too much. Don't even worry about this. Just cut your strips as you normally would. But if you're like, nope, I like everything lined up and just so, then give it a try. So again, I'm just going to make sure it's very easy to get twists and turns in fabric as you move it around the table. Let's see here. Yep, because I've kind of twisted it and moved it just a touch. I know I did. Yes, there it is. I'm like, why is that not lining up? Because I twisted it when I moved it. So that's what our strip's going to look like. So now when you put this on your quilt, now it's going to have a much more, those polka dots are going to hit in a more predictable place versus potentially maybe running off the quilt or maybe running into the quilt. So that's just something that I wanted to definitely take the time to mention to you. Now I went ahead and fussy cut my strips, my 4.5 inch by width of fabric strips, and binding is a plaid. In the pattern, it mentions cutting 2.25 inch strips. If you prefer 2.5 inch strips, there's plenty of fabric in your kit to go ahead and cut those 2.5 inch strips. That's a preference. Some quilters love 2.25, some love 2.5. So go ahead and do that. Next step, once we're doing that, here's something that she's mentioned. Measure the width of the rows through the center. Find the average number of the middle number. What is she talking about here? Well, what she's talking about is we have 4 rows. We want those rows, our hope is they're all the same measurement, right? That's going to make things really easy. She's basically trying to give us an idea of what we should cut these lengths of the sashing strips. The sashing strips is the black strip that's going to go beneath those top 3 rows and ultimately frame the inner border of this entire quilt. So she says measure the width of the rows to the center and then find the average number, she says in parentheses, or the middle number, and then trim 3 of the 1.5 by width of fabric strips to equal the average width of the rows as illustrated below. So let's look here. This is where you need some space and you want to line up on a nice number. Now you saw me sew that row together. I do not know what that's going to measure, but let's start with one of the rows that I have sewn together. We're just going to measure that together. You know, as you see, the quilt's kind of drawn up, but as I smooth it out with my hands, so just when you get ready to measure, know that, you know, I pressed that days ago, you know, just a couple days ago, actually on Sunday, yesterday, I did that. But go ahead if you want to repress certain things or just smooth it out with your hands. But let's go ahead and give a measurement here. And I see this measuring right now at 30.5 inches. So you could write that down or you can just remember that. And let's measure, let's measure the one that we just did together. Let's see how that went. I sure hope that measures 30.5. We literally just did this together. And look at what I just noticed. I want to show you this. Did you see this little tuck that I took right there? That block, if it measures under 30.5, I won't be surprised. Those little subtleties do that. So let's look. Yes, look. This is a kind of what I again call a happy accident of look how I'm measuring 30.25. Here's the thing. Yes, I could average those, but the truth is I've made a mistake. So I don't want to trim this to be to my mistake. I need to fix what I've done. So we know this one's short, 30.25. So let's put that aside, and I can already see where that went wrong. Also, this has the fusible interfacing on the back, which takes space. It takes bulk. and it takes more fabric to turn around that. So that too is playing a factor in that. So let's see what else we have here. Let's measure something else. Now this was a pieced block. If there was an error in it, it's very likely to be this because I may have made my piecing too small. We know these blocks are going to be dead on because we got to use our pop rulers. So you can almost know which rows are likely to have differences in lengths. All right, let's see here. Now this is measuring 30.5 inches. That's good. I got 2 of those. And we've got a short one here, but we see where the error came in. Let's put that there. And then let's measure this one. Let's smooth that out. And this one is also 30.5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix this row. I want those to all measure 30.5 because they can. If I adjust this and maybe make some other minor adjustments if need be, this quilt's going to go together and click together a lot better than me adjusting these sashing strips. So let's say that you've done everything that you feel you can do and you're like where it's going to be. What she's suggesting is you take those numbers and add them all together. In this case, you would divide by 4, and you'd come up with a measurement that wasn't quite, it's probably like it's not 30.25, it's not 30.5, but maybe 30.3/8. And you could cut that. Again, I recommend you go ahead and fix your strips to all measure 30.5 and go ahead and cut your sashing strips, 3 of those, to 30.5 inches. So what you're going to do with that, I'm going to fix that off camera, but I want to show you one of the blocks, what we know is correct, which was, we can pick the top row, that's fine, which is our click one with the cute little camera. I want to talk to you about the sashing strip. First off, let's cut it. Well, we know there's also a crease in there, so we're going to smooth that out first. Let's put that aside. Let's get that heating up. Anytime that I'm using a strip that has the fold, my step one is to actually get that out now versus trying to iron it later on. I just want that gone. I want everything nice and smooth. So when I do measure that, I'm measuring a nice smooth fabric, not something that has a little bit of an arc in it or a bump in it. I want everything to be exactly as it should be. So let me just trim off that. I think I have a little ruler on here with me. If not, oh, I do. Good. You know, having just a variety of rulers is so important. We'll just clean off that edge. So we're going to go 30.5 inches. I know that I'm going to fix that block to be 30.5. I'm going to make that block be 30.5. So let's go ahead and give that a cut. And I want to give you some pointers about just pinning on sashing strips, because it's really easy to always think that you're going to sew it together with the sashing strip on the top because it's the smallest fabric and you go sew. While that does make sense for most on this block, because I've only got 1 seam, 2 seam, 3 seams, and I want to see this. I want to see the bulk of my project. For strips like this that have all of these seams at the bottom, I would not do that. I would go ahead and put my strip on the bottom, and I would actually sew it from here. Remember that rolled seam that you saw me do? And I had to go back and fix that. You're just asking for a whole bunch of that if you sew with this side down, because as it approaches the feed dog on your machine, it naturally wants to just roll those seams back. So you know that if you pin well, there's nothing wrong with having that little strip on the bottom, and there's every reason to do that because now you have a visual on these seams. Now, if I have a purple thing, which I don't know if I have it in here with me, I'll see if I can grab one of those. It's this tool. It's just a couple dollar tool. And what that will do is it'll kind of keep those seams. You kind of press it down. Well, I'm going to go off camera for just a second. I want to show this to you. I'm going to actually sew this one on. I want you to see this. This other row is actually easier to sew, and I want to show you the most difficult row and how to just negotiate those seams that want to roll on you. So let me find that tool. I'm going to come right back because I want to show you the hardest row because all the others will be very easy compared to this one. Okay, so while I was off camera, I grabbed the purple thing, and it is truly called the purple thing. And I remember the first time I heard, I'm like, what is that? And then I used it, I'm like, I get that. Okay, while I was off camera, I took the time to pin, and pin some more, just because, just like before, the beginning and the end, we absolutely pinned that. And I also want to just, at every single intersection, my goal here is to just keep a good 1/4 inch seam allowance all throughout. Now, the job of the purple thing is going to be to keep my fingers out of the way and keep those flaps of those seam allowances laying nice and flat, so as the presser foot approaches it, it does not roll that seam. So let's go ahead and sew that together. Purple thing is going to be my best friend on this row. I'm going to go ahead and back stitch just a little bit. Check my alignment. I want to point out something right here. Do you see how that fabric is a little bit shorter than that fabric? I wanted to point out that because notice how the black fabric is laying right underneath here, but not here. I know this was my error. I could see that was my error. So don't line up with the error, line up with what's correct. And your 1/4 inch seam allowance will naturally compensate. Don't worry about that little gap right there. That iron heating up again. Now the pattern does mention to press toward your sashing strips. Naturally, you can see with all of these seams, you're not going to press another seam toward that direction. The fabric just would not want anything to do with that. It wants to press away from the pressure and toward that sashing. So let's just check that out. Make sure everything looks good. We're happy with what we're seeing. I like what we're seeing here. So you'll repeat that step with those top 3 rows, only the top 3. And notice I'm just giving a good smooth, I don't want to take a tuck like I did on that one row. And just continue pressing all of that out. All right, so I'll be able to do that off camera. We have a lot of territory to cover. So I'll keep pressing that out, but let's just revisit the pattern real quick. So we just click, we'll get a sashing strip beneath that. We just did this one here. We'll do the typewriter row, and I want to point out one thing with this, because of course, this will actually happen, I should say, when you sew these together, you'll need to pin these down, so that when you sew those rows together, that little paper coming out of the typewriter does not get sewn into the seam allowance. So what I'll go ahead and do is I'm going to fix that row. I'm going to adjust that row. I've got a little tuck in there. Check my seam allowances, re-sew that, sew the sashing on. I'm going to sew those 4 sections together. And then at that point, we're going to do another measurement check, where we'll be sewing our side inner borders on, our top inner borders on. We'll go ahead and make sure we're all squared up, and then will come our final outer borders and both sides and then top, and then go get the quilt quilted. So I have a lot of work to do. I know you do too. I'm going to check back shortly after I have these things sewn together so I can take you to the next phase of finishing up our Love Notes quilt. I'll see you in just a little bit. So I'm back, and I was able to adjust that bottom row. Let me talk to you about that bottom row, by the way. The interfacing I put on the back of that one embroidery block, I kind of put that on in the end. Remember how I said that Kim's instructions in the very beginning mentioned that, and we were anxious to jump right into the project and have someone stitch things down, and they hadn't put that interfacing on the back of the hand embroidery block. But I wanted to do that just to kind of feel how it would be different and stabilized. That bulk ended up being a major factor actually in me piecing that last row. So if you do decide, we're well into the program now or into the quilt now, but maybe you haven't even started yet. If you do decide to put an interfacing on the back of your hand embroidered blocks, I highly recommend as light of an interfacing as possible, because that bulk, we used a heavier interfacing that we had here, ended up being just, it caused these two seams to be bulkier than normal because this had to pivot around that on both sides. So I actually removed that because we hadn't stitched through it, and boy, that made a world of difference. So that's how I took care of that. I always like to figure out what happened here, what went wrong, and that was actually a very easy fix. So, but obviously if you had hand embroidered through that, it might not be as easy of a fix, or maybe you could cut some of that interfacing away, just some suggestions. So I always like to troubleshoot why a block doesn't come out the way that I was expecting. All right, now that those are all sewn together, I press my seams toward the sashing as recommended in the pattern. We jump right back in and find out what is next, and that will be our inner borders. And again, the way that we measured our rows, they're asking us to do it again, except this time top to bottom. This is on page 40 of our instructions, that she on the bottom left, measure your quilt lengthwise through the center. I've got threads everywhere. You probably do too from piecing your blocks together. We're going to measure top to bottom. And as I calculated what that measurement should have been, it should be 31.5 inches if my blocks were perfect and my seams were exactly 1/4 of an inch. We measured it twice and came out with, I was short by 1/8 of an inch. So instead of cutting my strips to 31.5, which is 31 4/8, I cut them to 31 3/8. And I've cut 2 of those. That'll be my left and right inner borders, and I'll sew those on, again, probably with this side up, because I don't want those seams to roll on me. So just like you've seen me do before, where it's very natural to want to have this side up, I'm not, because I don't want those seams to roll on me. So I will pin that and go ahead and sew that from this side on both the left and the right, and I'll press as instructed in the pattern, and I'll repeat that same process. She has us measuring our width, determining what the top and bottom inner borders, we'll cut those to those dimensions as well. Sew those on and repeat that same measuring process for your side borders first, followed by your top and bottom border. I'm going to do that off camera. It's going to take me a while. I want to measure everything perfectly. When we come back, I'll show you the quilt top, and let's talk through what some of the embellishments will be once we have the quilt quilted. We get it back. We get to put some, I see some twine. We get to drape that over this block. We get to cut out some hearts out of our red felt, and then as we turn the page, we can talk about how we position our little flag onto our mailbox. There's a little we get to go back into some of our previous instructions for previous weeks. There's a little bit of a guide where we can put that button so they line up all perfectly. And then we can talk about the pull flowers, which is going to be a lot of fun too. So I've got some work to do. I'll see you as soon as all of my borders are on, and we'll move on to the final embellishments of our quilt. I am back. I've been busy, as you can see, putting all those borders on, including our polka dot, and it is adorable. So now we get to what would be the next natural step is to either send it out for long arm quilting or quilt that yourself. That will be whatever you prefer to do. Once that's back, you will bind your quilt. Now we mentioned before that in the pattern it mentions cutting 2 1/4 inch strips. I cut mine to 2 1/2. If binding is new to you, we did a whole series on different types of binding that you could choose to finish a quilt. Be sure to view that if you're not sure how to bind a quilt, or maybe you want to learn some new ideas of some different options. Once your quilt is bound, there's just a few more things we get to do with that really fun embellishing quilt. So I'm just going to kind of scoot this up so we can kind of see the first section we'll be working on. This is, of course, still inside our final section 5 instructions. And it starts talking about this big block here. It's the Love Your Selfie block. We'll be using our twine. So that's the card that has the pull flowers, and then the twine is right around the top. So I grab that out. Step 1 is to just tie bows at both ends. I only just did one just to show you. And you can kind of decide the drape that you want. But of course, if you're going to tie that, just grab a bow here. In fact, I'll do a little higher. A bow here. I just wrap that around my index finger, push that through and make a little bow. And you could double knot that if you'd like. And then she mentions hand sew the twine onto the quilt at the center of the bow. So once you have that position where you want that to be, and of course I'm not going to secure that because I still have to quilt the quilt, and I will, by the way. We will go ahead and have our quilt quilted. You'll see this on Instagram, Facebook. Be sure to follow us there and you'll be able to see our finished quilt. And we want to see yours too. Be sure to jump into that conversation. We want to see your quilt as well. So once that's on, that's when she has some of these fun little felt hearts. So you go ahead and trace on paper, not fusible webbing, just paper, because as you can see in the jar, those hearts are truly lifted off the background, and if you used a fusible webbing, they would be down to the background. I love the dimension. So this is just plain paper. You could also use a freezer paper. Just trace that. Go ahead and cut that out on the line. The big heart, you'll be using your safety pins and pinning that along with your cute little Polaroid pictures that you have in your selfie block. And then when you get down to this portion of the quilt, you'll just sew, just like we did before on the typewriter. Remember how we stitched right straight through the heart? Same thing that we'll be doing here, spilling into our envelope, where we're just going to be stitching right down the middle of those red hearts, and it gives it that nice dimension, that lift right there. So that's a lot of fun to do as well. Signed, sealed, and delivered are mailboxes. Back in section 4, we can jump back to that. I'll just show you here. There's a button placement. We didn't trace that before because we like, where are we going with this? Well, now it's coming into play. We've made our dimensional flags. Remember we did that? That was a lot of fun. And we have these adorable little buttons. This is when you would go ahead and mark that spot. Now, as I went to mark this one, it happened to be right where that plaid was, and I really can't see it. So if you are also having difficulty seeing where the X should go ahead and just measure with a ruler. Maybe lay a ruler on here and measure the same distance from the edge of the mailbox to the X, and just so that they're all the same. Go ahead and sew your button on, maybe with a white or a red thread. So that'll be on there, and then you can just attach your mailbox flags. I mean, how cute is that? And of course, prop them up because you absolutely do have mail there. And then what's our next step will be our dimensional flowers. I think this is probably what sold me on just that teaser. I kept noticing the dimensional flower just completely captivated me because I think it's so fun to have dimensional things on quilt because we're so used to everything being flat that I was really intrigued by this. So it's the same process for the teal, red, and white flower. So one side is already got a knot on it, and one side is the pull. So if you're right-handed, you'll have this in your left hand, and you'll be pulling the string with your right. And of course, if you're left-handed, just the opposite. So be gentle. There are more than one strand of thread here, but still just be gentle. And go ahead and scoot the gathers all the way down. So pretty. And I love the texture. It's kind of like a grosgrain. I think I said that right, grosgrain. It's such a neat little texture, and there's a little scallop finish there. It just makes it so pretty. And we'll scoot that down. And her instructions: to make the pull flowers, we'll pinch the string in the one hand, our right-handed, and petals in the other, and we'll pull on the end without a knot, and that's what we're doing. Pull string away from petals until gathered to the desired shape. So if we want to kind of keep pulling, let's see, if we want to kind of form that into a pretty flower, you can kind of just shape that however you want. I'm going to twist that around. Just like that. To secure in place, tie a knot in the string close to the base. So you just tie this around. Now I've not done this before, so hopefully this is fairly straightforward to tie the knot. So let's see here. Ooh, that is a little bit tricky to tie the knot. So one thing that I would see, that I can already see would be helpful, is to use a wonder clip or a pin to just hold everything steady. I can see that already because as I let go of it, right, it wants to relax. So as we're working our way through this, I can see if you pin it or use a wonder clip to secure everything in place, now you'll be able to tie the knot. And then they say to use a needle and thread and sew the flowers to the stem in the bunches of love block. Now this is a really sturdy thread. I don't see a reason to actually use a different thread. So you could just go ahead and thread this and make this your actual thread that you're securing your flower onto the background, and you'll secure the white and the teal in the same fashion. And again, maybe pinning or clipping, or hey, if you find a technique that works, put it in the comments. We can all learn from each other. So we'll secure our flowers onto the background, and that is the completion of the Love Notes mystery quilt. My gosh, 5 weeks has flown by. It's been a lot of fun doing this with you. Leave us a comment. This is the first time we've ever done a Kimberbell project, but if you've been to the Shabby Fabrics website, you may have seen Twilight Boulevard. It is Kimberbell's amazing Halloween pillow. It has lights in it. It has so much going on. It's adorable. And we are quickly selling out of those kits. So be sure to grab that. There's more to come. If you have not already subscribed to our YouTube channel, do that. Of course, all of our social medias, and be sure to get on that email newsletter. That's where we let you know about programs like this and all that's to come. So thank you for sharing 5 weeks of your time with me, and I'll see you on a future Shabby Fabrics video.